Joining me on the podcast today is author Ryan Dalton.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt, and I am your host. This is the podcast where we learn how to become better game masters and role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. All right, guys, it is my pleasure to bring you an awesome interview each and every week that will help us become better game masters, better role players, because this is the greatest hobby in the world, and I know we love it all so much. Without any further ramblings from me, here is today's interview. My guest today is the author of the Time Shift trilogy, as well as This Last Adventure, author Ryan Dalton. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. When did you discover you wanted to be a writer?
Oh, man. Really early. I was always a book nerd. Since I could hold them, I've wanted books, and, my parents were great about always giving me access to books, as many as I could read, basically. And basically at the point where I realized that it was actual people that wrote the books that I loved. And this was, 6-7 years old. I remember even as a little kid thinking, okay, well, that's what I want to do. And so it was a goal from very early on. And then when I was around 10, we had a family friend who published a book, and that was just like even more reinforcement of that. And that's when I actually started writing and thinking, if he can do it, I'm going to try it. And so, through my teens and everything, it's funny, even though I had those early ambitions, I just kind of treated it like a hobby. It wasn't until my mid to late 20s that I started to take a second look and think, I think if I gave this everything, I could probably turn it into a career. And that's when it all took off.
Yeah, nice. And I had some similar experiences. I thought, when I was around 6 or 7 that I wanted to be a writer. And then I got sidetracked by having to eat food and things. And
life has a way of saying, wait, hold up a second.
Yeah, absolutely. And people looking at you like you're crazy sometimes when you say you want to be a writer, although I think that's becoming less and less true nowadays, especially with how technology has changed and the internet, and people realize that you can actually make money writing, and that can be, it can be a really cool thing. Well, that is awesome. I love to hear people, when they start out so young and then get to fulfill that later on. I think that is super cool. Now, you did also mention that you have a love of tabletop role-playing games. And so I'm going to have to ask you what your experience is with tabletop role-playing games.
Yeah. So over the years, and of course, I don't have as much time anymore, unfortunately, but I've played a number of different ones. The classic earlier editions of D&D, were very formative for how much I grew to love those. We played, I'm going back into the memory vault now. Sure. We played some, old school, everything from the old school classic BattleTech tabletop games to, I remember there was one called Necromunda, which was similar, but it was sort of like a post-apocalyptic type thing. And then there was Shadowrun. I kept wanting to call it Cyberpunk, but that's not right. But we were big into Shadowrun for a while, and then it's funny, even as a storyteller, I really enjoy playing as a character, so I haven't GM'd that much. But the one that I GM'd that I really enjoyed was there was a Serenity a role-playing game. So they had a source book that they brought out not long after I think the show went away. And so we had a group that played that. Probably the longest running game that I played that went for, I think, at least a couple of years was a Seventh Sea game, and Seventh Sea was really cool. I feel like it was you could tell its bones kind of sprang from like the D&D type style, but it really brought its own world and made for some really interesting stuff, some really cool characters, and we had a GM who was very accommodating. Like if we could justify something about a character, we would be able to do it. So that turned into a really good experience. And there were some other little ones peppered in here and there, but those were the high points for me.
Sure. That's awesome. And I think you're the first person who's ever mentioned that they played Serenity. I, of course, have seen the book and flipped through it at a store, but I never got to play. So that is interesting. Sadly, we're all looking for the alternate universe where Firefly got 10 seasons.
Man, aren't we all? Yeah.
Yeah.
It was fun. And, I was actually very impressed. We'd done a few games by that point, so we kind of knew what we were doing. And, but when I started in designing that game, I was very impressed with it was just one source book. There were no other, like support books out there, like 7C. There's like 50 different books that you could buy out for like one for each country and, different factions and things. But the Serenity one, even with just one source book, did a really good job of giving you a framework and then just saying, all right, go take the framework and have fun. And so it left a lot of room for creativity. And yeah, we had a blast.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think that was one of the weird times with rights where one RPG company had the rights to the TV show and one had the rights to the movie. Is that?
Man,
I'm kind of reaching back into. I remember reading an article about that. I think it seemed like it was very confusing because it seemed like there was actually two role playing games put out at different times, and I think that's what something was. I think that's what was going on there, but I would have to double check on that. But that was just a little extra trivia that I was remembering. I think I remember reading an article on that because there was a Firefly game and a Serenity game, and it was because the TV show and movies had different rights. You could buy the rights.
Man, what a mess!
Yeah. But that is really cool. Now, of course, you mentioned D&D in there. But then you also mentioned Shadowrun and then Serenity. Do you find yourself drawn more to fantasy or science fiction?
I definitely skew more towards, as far as role playing, more towards the fantasy stuff. And the sci-fi is a lot of fun. But yeah, there's just something I mean, it's going to seem an obvious word, but there's something magical about just doing any kind of fantasy genre. And I probably have the softest spot for the older 7th Sea version, just because we spent the longest on that, and just really got some cool stories. And it was one of those things where we really got to develop and grow those characters and go through a lot with them. And I mean, that made enough of an impression that I actually I took a lot of notes even then of like the different characters my friends had come up with, some of the things we had gotten into. And I told them, guys, at some point I'm going to use these characters in a book because they're too much fun. I could come up with, kind of another world, like an original world for these people to live in. And over the years, I've been writing other things, but that world that I created for those characters is still there and just kind of waiting to be written.
Yeah. And I guess for listeners who don't really know, like 7th Sea is kind of fantasy pirates, right?
Yeah, it's sort of like, if you think of it in kind of, boy, how do I put it? Imagine like a Renaissance era, but it happened in that world. It happened earlier than it did here. Like it's a time in history where like they should still have just like swords and armor and things like that, but gunpowder was invented way earlier than it was in our world. And so you've only got like it's essentially one type of armor that even matters anymore. So things have like the weaponry, not just guns, but the swords and everything have progressed to something different, much faster than they did like in our world. And then, when you fold in the fantasy element, there's lots of different types of magic and other things that you can do. And of course, it really steers into the fantasy part of it. But I thought it was a really interesting way, at least core way to develop the world. It's like, okay, well, let's look at what would happen if it was a world that had magic and also had gunpowder, like before it should have. So that was the basis for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've never gotten to play, but I have looked at it. And of course, the game designer whose name has become very popular, even though it is based on a series of movies. His name is John Wick, but his name has kind of been co-opted and unrelated to the movie with Keanu Reeves, the movie series, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
No, that's really interesting. And it's always seemed like an interesting world to me, because there is kind of this allure of the sea, right? You know, it's something that's focused a little bit more on the sea plus magic and sorcery. And it is always fun to just say your fantasy character has a firearm at some point.
Oh yeah,
about that.
Yeah, and if you can get a really cool crew with different stuff, I mean, we had like I the character that I made is I wanted him to be like a real kind of an outcast in a way with how he fought. And the interesting thing about guns is that they were still very new. Mm-hmm. And also considered to be like really looked down on. Anyone who was proficient with guns was really looked down on by the traditional sword schools. Mm-hmm. And so I said, well, I got to be that guy. And so I created this character that was even strange for that world, where he had sort of a duster and he had all these different pistols strapped to him that you couldn't see because they were under the duster. Nice. And I thought, how fun would it be for a guy in a world of magic to reach into his coat and suddenly the stuff starts, like bullets start flying through his coat as he's pulling triggers and stuff. And then we had a duelist that had some cool stuff and that he did. And yeah, it was a world that really lets you steer into like something weird.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. It sounds awesome. And then you said you had, I think you mentioned you had your most GM experience with Serenity. Was it just the show and kind of the universe that drew you into Serenity as well?
Me and my whole friend group, back then we were all super nerds, and so we were huge. We loved that show so much, and we'd sort of gotten to the point with 7th Sea, as much as we loved it, that we were ready for a break, for something different. And sure. When we discovered that there was even a source book out for a Serenity game, we jumped at that, and so that's when I had always avoided, jamming before, but for this, I thought, you know what, I think it's time for me to give this a shot. And so that's when I said, all right, let me get the book and I'll design the first adventure for you guys. And I found it really rewarding because it was, even though I had a source book to go on, it was not unlike, outlining a book. It was basically, I picked a bad guy. I picked something that the good guys had to do. I picked, how they came together and, the worlds they were on, and got to design some really fun henchmen that they had to fight. And it was rewarding in a different way. It's more work. It's definitely harder to be the GM, but it was also very fun, essentially having this thing that you design, putting them through it, but also having to do tons of improv to kind of, keep up with the curveballs that the players throw at you. So I ended up really enjoying it.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you were just talking there, I mean, I just had a random thought, but, thinking of Serenity with a, kind of a tight knit crew that we follow. And then you talking about 7th Sea, where you follow the crew of like a ship. It just seems that that kind of trope of a crew, of course, we could think of Star Trek or some other science fiction shows where you have a crew of people and we follow that. It just seems that is like, I don't know, that trope just seems to be like super cool, and it kind of resonates with us a bit. And I don't know, that was just a random thought that I had. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. Don't mean to throw you a curveball or anything.
Oh no, that's fine. Well, the people like group dynamics, and that's one of my favorite things to write. And, whether it's like a sailing ship crew or just an adventuring crew or a spaceship crew, there's a number of reasons that I think people like it. For one, I think it's a great opportunity to very quickly and efficiently experience different types of characters. And when you have, radically different types of characters and you get to watch them bounce off each other, there's so much opportunity for fun there. Because you can have, someone who's the hero, but then you can have them surrounded by, these wacky other characters that, people that shouldn't be in a group together probably. And, some people that have, other agendas. And then, it's just really fun to put characters like that in a room or whatever, and just see what happens when they're together.
Yeah, absolutely. I think too that kind of the bonds that can develop between those characters is always appealing for us as well. I think in Firefly, right, we see the bond and the code that the captain lives by, and then that he's forged with his first officer and different things. We always find loyalty and sacrifice for your friends. That's just seems to, it just speaks to our natures, right? It's just like deep inside of us, I think. That's another idea. Yeah.
And who knows what you're going to come up with? That's part of the fun too, is like when you put these characters together, you never know what's going to happen. Even as, a writer, for me, that's part of the fun, is like, I really start getting to know my characters when they start having to interact with other characters. That's when they really come to life for me. Yeah. And, even just a simple thing things that you can't predict, like, okay, the guy who created Wolverine and the guy who created Colossus, I guarantee you, neither of them thought when those were created, hey, I bet when these two get together, one of them is going to pick the other one up and throw him like a human spear, at bad guys. But when you have a group dynamic and these characters come together, those ideas can happen. That's like, hey, this will be cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And and everybody brings something different to the table. So you're able to explore all kinds of different angles. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then you can have characters that, one of probably my favorite character, right, in the Time Shift trilogy, which is my time travel mystery series, is it's a supporting character that's kind of mouthy. I always like the mouthy characters. They're fun to write, but low key, and he never really talks to anyone about this, but low key, he considers himself the guy who's willing to do the things that the heroes are not willing to do because they're too good. But he knows that sometimes that stuff has to be done to protect, the heroes and what they're trying to do. And so he never talks about it with anyone, but sometimes he goes off, and just does what has to be done. And it's fun having characters like that are so different than the main people we're following. And you get to have a whole different experience with them.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you did mention some of your books there. So you said you kind of, later in your 20s, then, kind of, I guess, rediscovered writing and decided to put some effort into it. Maybe could you tell us a little bit how that went? And then what was your first book and what was that experience like?
Sure. Yeah. So it was mid to late 20s. I'd been working in the corporate world for a while and, paid the bills, but it was not satisfying in the way that, that I had hoped.
It's a common theme.
Yeah. It was a good living, no complaints there, but, it just didn't scratch any kind of itch for me at all. Mm-hmm. And I started thinking, well, I started looking for an exit, essentially, like, what else could I do? And I started brainstorming. I kind of started with, well, what am I good at and what do I like? Yeah. And then I finally kind of landed on, hey, you know what? I used to write a lot. I've always loved it. So why not really, give it a legitimate shot? And at that point, once I decided to do it, I was pretty much all in. I took a couple of years after that to just work on the craft. I read a ton. I wrote a ton of all different kinds of things. Lots of short stories in lots of different genres. I was just wanting to experiment, get to know myself like as a real writer, and just get more experience. I would even do things like if I knew friends were wanting to sell something, I would say, hey, let me write your Craigslist ads. And I would write these wacky, weird, silly ads that would always sell the item. And because people would laugh and then they would want to buy it. In fact, that actually led to real work because my brother had a computer to sell. And I said, hey, let me write that for you. We were living in Phoenix at the time. And so I wrote this, just this crazy ad. And the person who bought it said, "Hey, can you bring it to our office?" Well, it turned out that office was a boutique advertising firm there in Phoenix. And the woman who owned it said, "Do you do this professionally? Do you write ads?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Well, you should." And she hired me.
Oh, wow.
And so I did freelance advertising work for them for about a year. And that was a completely different experience. And so, yeah, I just acquired experience and got to know myself. And then after a couple of years, I thought, I think I'm ready to really give this a shot. So I had been maintaining a notebook with ideas. And then I went through that seriously and said, okay, let me pick the one that really speaks to me. And there was one that really stood out, like that really intrigued me, and that I thought I could make something that I hadn't seen before. And I started on that, and that became The Year of Lightning, actually, the first book that I sold.
Okay. No, that's great. And that's a fun story with you writing an ad and then getting a job from that. That's really fun.
It was so wild. Yeah. Cause I was just, writing I was steering into my weirdness and things and just making things super silly. And I was actually surprised that like an advertising pro wanted to use me, but it was fun.
Yeah. And I think sadly, this is kind of the place in people's, people who want to be writers kind of get stuck sometimes because they don't know how to put, so much preparation into becoming a writer while, putting food on the table. And I think that can be a really kind of confusing time for a lot of people who are trying to be writers. I know it was confusing for me, and I just have to be honest and tell people that it was like, well, I basically worked 2 full-time jobs for like 4.5 years. Yeah. That's just what happened,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, through all of that, I was still, working a corporate job and everything. Now I had some more disposable time because I'm single. I don't have kids. So, I don't have to split my attention that way. I'm continually amazed by people with families that are able to write books still. And so, yeah, I didn't have that to take care of, but yeah, for a while, I mean, through writing my whole first trilogy, it was really, I would go to my regular job. And then when that job ended, I would grab a quick bite to eat. I would go to a coffee shop and I would write until I had to fall asleep and I would go home. And I did that for years. So it's not the healthiest way to live, but I was on fire and I was determined to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's the way I felt too with my role-playing game books. It was just like, I had to do this. And of course, I was married and having babies at the time, and it was not easy. It was not an easy thing. But I couldn't, I could not do it. Right. Like, I just I had to do it. I knew I had to do it. And it wasn't easy, but that's, sometimes you got to do what you got to do, I guess.
Once I really had the taste for it and knew, okay, I can do this as a real thing. Yeah. There wasn't a choice anymore. I was going to do it no matter what it took.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And now, why don't you tell us a little bit more about the Time Shift trilogy, and then we can dive into maybe some of your writing process and some of your newer books. But why don't you tell us about the Time Shift trilogy and maybe some of that experience coming together, putting together that first book in them?
Sure. Yeah. So as I said, they're YA time travel mysteries. They follow 2 teenage twins, a boy and a girl, in a fictional town that I created. And the kind of the seed of that story, like what kicked the whole thing off, is I just had a picture of something flash up in my head, and I pictured these 2 twins walking by this old kind of this old house. It was kind of creepy, and then they realize the house has no doors. There's only windows up at the top. They don't see any way in or out of the house at all. And then while they're noticing that, they happen to look up in the window, and there's somebody that's staring down at them through the window. So there's someone in there. And I had that like picture in my head, like a movie scene, and it gave me chills. And I was like, oh man, I've never seen anything like that before. And I started asking questions. That's how I end up even now developing a lot of initial parts of a story is like, okay, well, who are they? What are they doing in there? Are they good or bad? And so answering all those questions, started to lead to creating a story. And then, for the conflict that was coming, I had to think, okay, well, these twins, what kind of people are they that they wouldn't see that and just move on, but that they would stick their noses in it and get into trouble. And so, yeah, at first it was just a lot of questions, and it was very fun to me to answer like, okay, well, maybe this is why he's in the house. Maybe this is what's happening. And in what came out, it ends up connecting to these crazy lightning storms that are happening throughout the town. And it folds in a time travel element. And it ends up approaching, I created a whole time travel system for it. And then, the first book is very much the conflict in that town and trying to protect the town from what's happening in the house, essentially. And then, so I wrote that. And then the publisher that bought it was really liked the story, and I think really kind of understood what I was trying to do with it. And I had mentioned that I wanted to make it a trilogy, and they liked it enough that they said, "Look, just give us a general outline of what you intend for the other two, and we're just going to buy the whole trilogy."
Wow.
Yeah, which felt really great. It was a good vote of confidence. So, I mean, by the time I had written book one, I already had basic outlines of the next two books, and I knew what the last scene of the last book was going to be. So I knew where it was all going. And, in book two, it really expands. Like in book one, you're in one town. In book two, you get glimpses of, not just other points in time, but I don't want to spoil too much, but it really expands. You learn a lot about the whole universe and how time works. And I ended up treating time like a type of energy that can be manipulated. And so I came up with a system for how they would use the energy that, the kind of time as the energy that drives the universe, essentially. That ended up opening doors for me to come up with some fun ways to use that. So it goes from, in the first book, we need to figure out this mystery so we can help our town, to by the end of the series, somebody's trying to break the entire timeline, and we need to protect that.
Yeah. Wow. It sounds awesome. And it's really interesting that you kind of dove in and kind of created your own system. Do you think your time playing tabletop role-playing games kind of helped you when it came to devising kind of your world and this time element and all that?
I think all the things I did previously it helped. And by the time I was ready, especially to write the first book, I knew, okay, it's going to be a large cast of characters. It's going to be mystery and time travel, all three of which can be difficult on their own. So I knew that I had to be very deliberate in how I planned the story, even before I wrote it. And so I've become a very heavy outliner. And so that was my way of really keeping control of everything, and keeping everything straight, making sure everything connected and made sense. And especially as with the second and third books, when I did some crazier things, I would hand the book to beta readers and say, specifically, and among whatever else you want to note, I want you to try to break my time travel system and how I use time. I want you to note any holes in that, anything I haven't considered. And do your best to find the breaks in it so that I can fix it. And so what it ended up, I feel like coming out as a fairly, for science fantasy, a fairly bulletproof time travel system. So I was really proud of that.
Yeah, nice. And it's interesting to hear that you say you outline, and I'll ask you a few questions because there is kind of in the writing community, there is a debate between outliners and then people who have various different names, like a discovery writer, or sometimes called pantsers, which is like the most ridiculous name I've ever heard of. But I find it interesting that most people that I talk to and most people that have books published or available in some form, write outlines. I have not really met somebody who says they are like a full on discovery writer and just kind of sit down without an outline. So it is interesting to hear you talk about an outline. Maybe could you kind of walk us through, like, if you were starting a book, what would your kind of process of starting an outline kind of look like?
Sure. Yeah. And I will preface this by saying there's really no wrong answer. The only for any writer, the right answer is what works for you. I have been, because I've been publishing long enough, I've been fortunate enough to meet and learn from a lot of different writers, and I've met the whole spectrum. I'm probably on the pretty far end spectrum of outlining, even though I don't outline every single thing. But I've met people that start out with a general outline and then just go from there. I know one particular writer who, and she's a New York Times bestseller, so it can work. She has an idea. She shuts herself in a room for weeks and just writes literally until she drops, and just kind of bleeds it all out. No planning or anything, and then she goes back afterwards and kind of hammers it into shape. And so, yeah, there's all sorts of processes out there. For me, of course it changes a little bit with each book, because each book has different needs, different tones. But in general, I start out kind of vague, and then I get more and more specific as I go along. So, I start out with the general concept phase, which is just brainstorming, what ifs, putting together playlists, which are, is really important to me for establishing tone and finding character and everything.
What do you mean a playlist? Like music?
Music. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Music. Every one of my books has a pretty expansive soundtrack.
Wow.
Sometimes excuse me. Sometimes it's just for general mood. Sometimes it's the themes to specific scenes or characters, but that's a huge part of my early creation process. And in fact, I'm in that stage right now with the next thing I'm working on. So yeah, that's all like very loose concept work. And then when I start getting a feel for, okay, this is the general story, this is the general flow of it, this is, the general thoughts on the main characters, that's when I start getting a little bit more regimented. And I'll start thinking in terms of scenes and progression and connective tissue between those, and putting all that together. And once I've got that clear in my head, that's when I start the actual stages of outlines. So I'll have a higher level outline, kind of like 1,000-foot outline, from start to finish, is all the general things that are going to happen in the story. I'll also develop a separate outline for character arcs. So any main characters or important side characters, I actually have an outline just specifically for their character progressions through the story. And then once I've got, a lot of that in my mind, I'll do the up close kind of iterative outline where I'll do a very detailed outline a few chapters at a time. So I'll take the first, for instance, the first 3 chapters. I'll do a super up close, beat by beat, sometimes dialogue included outline. And then I'll go write those few chapters. And the reason I don't do all of the chapters first is because I still want to leave room for creation, for if there's something that's going to come up, like when I'm writing chapter 2, that it's like, oh, I hadn't thought of that before, but that's better, that I can very easily incorporate that into the rest of the story without having to rewrite a whole outline. So yeah, at that point, it's just, I'll write a few very detailed chapter outlines. Then I'll go draft those chapters, and then I'll go back and outline the next chunk of chapters. That's in general how I tend to do it.
Okay. No, that's really interesting. And I'm sure, like you said, obviously, probably every writer tackles this in a completely, their own way and has kind of their own ideas. But it is interesting to hear you talk about the outline, because I know, I released my first novel in 2021, and I could not have finished it if I hadn't written that outline at the beginning, and now it changed, and my outline changed quite a bit here and there, especially in the middle of the book. If you were to look at the first outline that I wrote and then read the novel, you would be like, well, where did this come from kind of thing in some, in some places or whatever. But it was just like, I think you need kind of that flexibility when you get a good idea, and or you come to places and you're just like, oh, I thought I could do this, but I can't do that, so I need some way to accomplish that. Here are some of these extra scenes, or here's some of these extra things that come into it, and and kind of keep things a little fluid as well. But because I think that's when people when they criticize outlines, they're like, I'll hear sometimes people say, well, I want to leave room for like creation. I want to leave room for, some flexibility. And it's just like, you can have both. You can have an outline and flexibility. Why not?
Exactly. I've had people say that exact thing to me. Like I wouldn't want to be locked into an outline. And I tell them, well, it's your outline. You can do what you want with it. It's not, exactly. Nobody's standing over your shoulder saying, hey, that wasn't in your outline. I mean,
exactly.
Yeah. So, I think no matter how heavy an outliner you are, you do have to leave room for that in the moment kind of spark of inspiration. Like if something hits you that hadn't done it before, or I've had scenes that have gone a completely different way because I had intended them one way and the character sort of took over and was like, no, I'm not doing that. I'm doing it this way. And you can't go with that every time necessarily, but there have been scenes where I thought, okay, I've developed this character to the point where they kind of have an opinion about what's going to happen here. And so in this scene, I feel like I can trust them and just go with it. You definitely still leave room for creation. And but yeah, I think you're right. I think a lot of people are afraid of the word outline because they think it's too rigid. Yeah. On the other side, I know writers that have been doing it as long as me that they don't like outlines for themselves, because if they're not discovering it in the moment while they're writing, it kind of loses the magic for them. So they have to discover and create things at the moment when they're drafting. And that's perfectly valid too if it works for them. It's just there's all points on that spectrum, and it's just the only way to know what works for you is to try things and get more experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, with experience, I'm sure there are some writers out there who basically can just hold the outline in their head, right? They can just kind of hold some of those ideas in their head and write it down. And that would just come through experience and just working with your craft and understanding story structure. I'm sure, I keep saying my novel or whatever. I put out my novel. My novel's a practice, right? This was practice for me. I'm practicing. I'm trying to learn, some of these things, and I'm trying to see what process works, for me and that. So I'm sure that there are some people who can do it, but it's just funny that the people I've interviewed on the podcast, all of them say they outline. So, to some degree. So I just think that that's kind of funny, that there does seem to be pushback against outlining sometime. And I don't think that there should be, because like you said, it's your outline. You can change it, right? Like, you don't put the outline in the front of the book so people can see it when they're reading it or whatever. If you want to change the ending, change the ending, right? You just
absolutely,
or whatever, or don't even go back and revise the outline. Just change your scenes and then and leave the outline behind. But at least maybe something got you started, or the outline kind of propelled you along the way, or something like that. I just think it is. I just think it's interesting, and thank you for humoring me about like diving into outlines and things like that, because I think obviously a lot of people who listen to the show, not only are they role players and game masters, but I think secretly all role players and game masters want to be novelists or writers, or they are anyway, right? Either they want to be or they are, because we're just so in love with story. We're just so in love with stories and characters and setting, and we want to play around with that. And of course, the novel or short stories is a perfect place to go, or screenwriting or whatever else is just a perfect kind of place to go with all of that. And so, we talked a little about your Time Shift trilogy. I know you have a new book out, and it's called This Last Adventure. Why don't you talk about that a bit?
Yeah. So, that's brand new. It just came out February 1st, and it is a much different story than the Time Shift trilogy was. It's a much more kind of up close personal story. This is middle grade, so it's skewed a little bit younger. But it's still been adults that have read it and enjoyed it. But it's definitely meant for younger teens. Mm-hmm. This one follows a teenage boy, 13-year-old boy, who at the start of the story, his grandfather gets diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And so the boy tries using storytelling and shared fantasies and shared adventures, like pretend adventures, as a way to try to save his grandfather's memories from Alzheimer's. Oh, wow. And a much different, like I said, more personal type story. Mm-hmm. Flex a completely different muscle with that kind of story, but that was a very rewarding book to write. And so far, people seem to be responding well to it, and especially people who've gone through something similar. And that's been really encouraging that people have really responded to it.
Yeah. And it sounds fascinating. I was going to ask too, I asked about outlining and that. What does kind of your editing process look like? If you don't mind, we'll dive into the weeds a little bit more, but once you have kind of your first draft or whatever, what kind of, what does your editing process kind of look like?
The first thing I do is, this isn't necessarily an editing pass, but when I'm drafting when I'm doing the first draft, when I sit down to write, I will almost always start by reading the last chapter that I wrote. And that's less for editing. It's more just to get myself immersed back in the world. But along the way, if I notice something that needs attention, I'll either fix it right then if it's easy, or make a note of it. If it's something bigger that I want to come back to, and then I'll continue on with the next chapter that I was going to write. Once I'm done with the whole book, I will let it sit for a minimum of 2 weeks, probably closer to 3 or 4. And I won't look at it at all. I'll do something else in that time. And that's so I can come back for the next draft and look at it with fresh eyes, almost as if I'm not the one who wrote it. And I can look at it more objectively and say, okay, well, this worked great and I need to steer more into that. Or there's a plot hole I hadn't thought of, or that didn't work great and I need to polish that. And so that is what becomes the second draft, is reading through it and saying, okay, let's apply notes I made before. And let's also, for the new stuff I'm noticing, we're going to do that. We're going to take care of those. It's at that point that I'll give it to alpha readers, just, 1 or 2 people that always are the first ones to read my work. And while they're working on it, I'll start probably making notes for draft 3. And then once I get their feedback, and I'll combine that with other things I'd wanted to address and go for a third draft there. At that point, after the third draft, I'll probably give it to a couple of beta readers, which it tends to be other professional writers. You do this long enough, you find other writers that are kind of in the same spot that you are. And so you end up trading around a lot and reading each other's work and, just offering feedback and things. And so at that point, I'll get the feedback from them. And then based off of that, I'll work on a fourth draft. At that point, that's when I'll hand it to my agent. It's as long as I think, okay, this is like it's in the shape where it's ready for the agent to see it. Then I'll hand it to her, and then we'll talk about next steps. Okay. And if you sell the book, once you're working with an editor, that's that's probably another several drafts probably as well. So, well, like this last adventure, I think total, and this wasn't like full drafts or rewrites or anything like that, but total went through 8 to 10 drafts before the print version was ready.
Okay. No, that's interesting. And I know, I mean, I guess just for me, it's kind of just a different experience because, you know, I can't even, this is so bad. I can't even remember how many role-playing game books I have now. I think I have like 26, maybe 28 role-playing game books that are out. And, you know, I publish all of those through my own company and self-publish them. And I just, when I wrote my novel, I went ahead and self-published that as well. And, just kind of to get your take, I think sometimes we get stuck, like you mentioned, you know, you have an agent. I think some people get stuck on that. Like, if you don't mind me asking, like, how did you get your agent? Because I can't get any to even talk to me.
Well, it was a long time and a lot of hard work.
Yeah.
You know, if you're wanting to traditional publish, which I think self-publishing also is perfectly valid, you know, it's just, you know, it just depends on what you want. Then, you know, if you wanted to do it in the traditional route, it will test you. I mean, especially right now with, you know, the entire world in such a crazy situation, publishing is the hardest that I've ever seen it at the moment. Wow. Especially for people that are just trying to break in and start with getting an agent. It's tough. But the way that I got my agent is, you know, once the book was, you know, getting ready to the point where I thought it was fairly close. I had already been doing research and putting together a list of agents and agencies that I thought might be a good fit for the book and might like it. But I was also looking for a career agent, not just one who would represent this book. So, you know, once I had that list, which it was over 100 agents. I should probably go back and say I sold the Time Shift series without an agent. I sold it to a small publisher. And, you know, with that, I probably queried 120 or so agents. Wow. And I got lots of good responses that were like, hey, this is really good work. But the bad part was that they said basically, I don't know what to do with it. Yeah. And that was one of the reasons it was so encouraging when the publisher like got what I was trying to do with the Year of Lightning. Because it's like finally someone who understands what I'm going for. Yeah. Do you know, because, you know, with a lot of agents, they were just afraid they weren't confident that they could sell it just because it was kind of weird. And so, you know, I went through all of that and, you know, ended up for a few years just writing that series. And, but I always still wanted a partner, you know, and wanted an agent. And so, when I was going to write the next book, I thought, okay, well, you know, we'll try again. This idea that I was writing for this last adventure, I did think would give me a better shot. And this isn't why I chose it, but I think maybe more people could relate to this story and be intrigued by it. Okay. So yeah, then I started querying. So, I mean, it's tons of research because you're researching not only not publishing houses, the agencies, but the individual agents, and each agency has its own requirements for what you submit to them. And then within that, sometimes the individual agents will also have their own requirements. So, I mean, it's, you know, tens and tens and tens of hours of research, just putting the list together and knowing what everybody wants. Yeah. And then I started querying. I would probably query. I started out by sending out like 10 different queries. You don't do it all at once because you never know what valuable feedback you might get from someone who's willing to offer you specific feedback. Mm-hmm. And that may point out something that may be something I need to fix before I query more. So you don't query them all at once. And I ended up, it was actually a very, very nice having a much different experience with that book. Because of course I got rejections. Every book, you know, the best book in the world is going to get rejections because it's just not every agent is right for it or right for you. But kind of when all was said and done, I had three agent offers that wanted to represent me. And then I ended up going with who's still my agent now, Tricia Skinner, and she's awesome, and we get along great. And she was exactly what I needed in an agent, and she was very excited about that book and getting it out there. And then after I signed with her, I think it was 6 months or so that we found the right publisher for it. So it's a very truncated version of a very long, arduous process.
No, and I thank you for going through that, because I think for a lot of people that's still like, it seems like the mystical, magical place, right? Where we're just like, I don't even know how that works. If you been in a different industry or something like that, then you start hearing, agent and publishing and stuff. And it just seems like this, maybe an arcane process, for people, just to get an agent or something like that. So thank you for indulging my questions about that and going into that. Yeah,
sure. You know what it comes down to? It's a lot of hard work, and do not cut corners. Because even good books are going to get tossed out if you don't follow agency submission guidelines. And it's just, be professional. Don't be weird.
Oh no, I'm finished.
Well, you can be weird if it's like, artist weird, like your story is weird. That's fine. But when it comes to how you submit and it's just, you can let your story be weird, but in the way that you are, you got to be professional and treat this like a job.
Yeah.
And so, that's even just doing that. People would set themselves up above a huge percentage of the people that query, because a lot of people that query, some of them are just wing nuts and aren't going to get anywhere. Some of them are really weird and come in already either arrogant or almost kind of angry and resentful about the whole process, and they put people off right away. Or they send out mass queries and don't follow guidelines for individual agents and things. And so, just doing the research and putting the work in will already put you above a lot of people who query.
Yeah. I've heard stories like that as well, where it's just put your name on it, put your name on the letter, and you might have a better chance. Just weird things that people will do sometimes when they're reaching out to somebody. It's just oh, right, you need to know my name. I should put that on my paper, on my letter or whatever.
Yeah, there's that, or even stylistic mistakes. There's a part in every query where you essentially try to entice them with your story. And something I see in a lot of newer writers' queries is that they use that part to just describe their story.
Yeah.
But they give away too much. And they don't treat it like they should, like it's a sizzle reel. They're supposed to. That's supposed to tease and entice the agent or the editor down the road to say, "Ooh, I want to read more about that."
Yeah.
And so sometimes it's just also understanding what you're trying to do here. You are trying to sell your work, so you got to make somebody want to buy it from you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great point too, because I know I give some talks and stuff about self-publishing, and I have spent a lot of time writing book descriptions on Amazon and different places. And that is the mistake that I see everybody make. They write a wall of text telling everything that happens in their book, and just describes everything that happens in their book. And as shocking as it may seem, is people don't want to read book descriptions. They want to read books. Yep. And you need to sell your book in a few sentences to that potential customer on Amazon. And that will make or break your book, right? That will make and break your sales, depending on your book description there on Amazon. And
absolutely,
I try to make sure people understand that when they're writing their books, and that when I talk to people who are self-publishing, it's just well, your book description was, it was 500 to 800 words, and you told me that they get the thing in the end.
Right.
Maybe let's cut that down to less than 100 words, maybe even less than 50 words, and tell me why I should read it to see if they get the thing in the end. Right.
Sure.
Yeah. So I think and I'm not making fun of anybody. That is such a hard lesson to learn, because kind of back in the day when I was younger and foolish, I did all of this stuff, right? Like, I made every mistake in the book. I sent short stories to people, without following their guidelines. I sent, it has a huge typo right in the first sentence. I mean, come on. Like, why didn't I notice that? Right. Like, or send it to the wrong magazine, or send it to the wrong publisher, right? Like, you send a science fiction thing to a fantasy, somebody who does fantasy. I mean, that's just,
yep.
And guess what? I've done all that. I did all those things. I wrote the terrible Amazon product description until I realized I had to do this in a different way. So, I mean, sometimes you have to go through it, but I think the key is as long as you're learning from it and improving, you're going to stand better shots. If you just put it out there and say, hey, well, nobody liked my book, or nobody liked my query letter. And then if I look at your query letter and you don't have your name on it and you didn't follow the guidelines, well, that's not their fault, right? That's something else. Yeah.
I mean, it's the kind of thing where if you don't fully commit to it, both the selling and the craft of it, it's, your success is going to be middling. I knew a particular writer who is a really good beta reader. They know the core tenets and the rules and the things of writing, give good feedback, but their own work, to me, is really not up to par. Mm-hmm. And I think, and they've been writing for a long time, a number of different books. And I think it's because they don't take the criticism. Because I have seen where they will ask for a beta read and you'll give them, they'll get, lots of really good feedback, and they won't resent it. They'll say thank you, but then they'll apply 0 of it.
Yeah.
And I came to realize it's because they felt like that they were already at professional writing level, and they were absolutely not.
Yeah.
And so even professional writers can't fall into the trap of thinking, I've got everything I need, I'm as good as I need to be. If you're not always trying to improve and write the next thing better, then it's probably not going to go well for you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, so much, is staying humble, right? Staying humble, keeping yourself willing to learn about things. I think that is so important. And exactly what you're saying there. It's just, I don't know. I mean, I guess there's so many skills involved, because you do have to spot when, the criticism doesn't work, and you have to spot when the criticism is on point. You have to be honest,
yes.
About yourself and about your writing, and it's just, and sometimes obviously that can be very hard. Sometimes it could just be a thing where you're not really recognizing the two. And then it can be a pride issue, I guess, or and that's unfortunate. And it's just, well, I had an experience, when I was writing my novel, The Spaceport Gambit. I worked, all morning. I was writing, and then in the afternoon, I was going to read, a short story by Clifford Simak, the classic Golden Age science fiction writer. And I pull out his short story, and I read the first sentence. And I was just like, oh my gosh, I have so much to learn about writing, right? Like, I read one sentence, and it was just like, I can't even put words on the page compared to Mr. Simak here, right? Like, it's just like, you just have to, stay humble with it and be able to, I guess that's the really trick. You really do have to tell the difference between good writing and bad writing, or just mediocre writing and good writing. And then understand that it's just like I'm on the bad to mediocre side. If I really, if I look at a master, of course now Cymac's a master. If I look at that, it's like I have to be humble about it and then learn what he's teaching me, right? Like in the one sentence, he told me that it was rainy, foggy, and there were robots, and it was a solemn occasion. And I don't think he used any of those words, right? Like it was just amazing. And I think that's I don't know. It's a tough skill to learn that we have to, and like I said, it took me a long time before I would ever approach this. And of course I didn't do this years ago. And it took me a long time to really realize, what writing is, what good writing is, what structure to things are. And it was, it took a long time of reading books and reading screenplays and, to really see, to read a book and see the structure behind it. And it's a lot of work.
Oh, yeah. Well, and I'll tell you when a lot of aspiring writers get discouraged and when the majority of them quit is before they have their breakthrough, because there's a point where you have good taste in stories, what a good story looks like, what it reads like, but you cannot recreate it yet. And that's the point where a lot of writers quit, where they say, okay, well, I'm just no good at this or that. But yeah, of course you're no good at it because you just started. So you have to keep going and keep learning, keep reading, and eventually you'll get to the point where your taste and your ability are on the same level. And while at the same time being humble enough to know, of course there's always more to learn. You can also be at the point where you've dialed into your craft, what makes your voice unique, what you're bringing to, writing that's, someone else may not be. So you kind of keep both in your head at the same time. You never consider yourself a master because you always want to be learning, but at the same time, you can get to the point where you're competent enough to say, hey, I do know that I'm good at this. And so then you can really enjoy the writing, knowing that, hey, I've got the craft and the fundamentals down. Now I can have fun with whatever makes my style, weird and different.
Yeah, absolutely. And your point there is just absolutely great, that it's usually the people will stop right before the big break happens, or the tipping point will happen. And I know years ago when I went to school, when I went to college, I got a degree, and I studied filmmaking and screenwriting. And that's usually when I was doing some of that in the past and talking to producers and things, it is usually, you're getting to the level, but then you just can't, you just can't wait any longer, right? Like you just can't, for me, it was like, I just needed food, right? I needed to do something else and I couldn't get past that one place. And, and it is an interesting, it is an interesting thing because it does then kind of wrap in self-doubt and that it's just like, well, what if I don't reach that level? Right. And it can be tricky, for people to really be able to, see in their, to see that they actually do have the ability to accomplish what they're trying to accomplish. And like I said, I'm being a bit facetious and stuff, when I can, when I'm saying, I compared to Cymac, my writing's bad, right? And I'm being, I'm being kind of silly, but it's true, right? Like, I mean, come on. But, I think I'm good at it and I enjoy doing it. And I know I'm going to keep learning and applying. And, plus by my age, Clifford Cymac had written probably in the neighborhood of, it'll just be a guess, but it'd be thousands of short stories by the time he was my age. Right. So he had way more practice and way more focus than I have been able to apply to the craft. So of course he's going to be better than me, but I can, like I said, I was being facetious, but I can tell that I have talent and I have some ability and I'm willing to work at it. You know, but there, you know, it can be a long slog, right? It can be you know, when the rejection letters pile up, and when you know, or when, you know, when you self-publish a book and it doesn't start moving, and you're trying to figure out some marketing and stuff, it can be the dark night of the soul kind of thing, right? It could just be like, oh man, you know, what am I doing here? But I think is
it will test you. I mean, well, you want to be an author, you will have, you know, keep at different stages having to prove to yourself that this is still what you want to do. It will definitely test your resolve.
Yeah.
And, you know, whether you want to stick with it, and, you know, if you really love it, and, you know, then you'll stick with it. But, you know, I've had people that have approached me and just, you know, asking, you know, advice about publishing and this and that. And usually what I'll do is, and not in a way to discourage them, I'll just give them in 5 minutes my 10-year journey. And at the end of that 5 minutes, if they can hear that and say, okay, what are my next steps? Then they may be able to do it. Not be able is the wrong way to put it, because I don't want to seem discouraging. Or usually at the end of that 5 minutes, they'll understand whether this is for them or not, whether they love it enough to say, okay, I'm good at putting that much work, possibly spend years getting there with no guarantees. And if they decide it's not for them, fine, you know, do whatever you want, obviously. But you got to make sure it's really what you want.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And two, you know, just being able to, you know, like I said, you know, we have to be honest with ourselves, you know, we have to, you know, if we're just not learning and not progressing, then something's wrong, right? Or if, you know, and like I said, I've done all this stuff. I'm not discouraging anybody out there. You know, I've done all this stuff. You know, for years I said I wanted to be a writer, and I wanted to be you know, and I'm a writer. I want to be a writer. And for that entire year, I wrote maybe, you know, 50 words, you know, of a story, right? And that's just, you know, if that's what it all is, then I don't want to be that. Or if I want to be it, you know, then I should be doing more than 50 words, because writers write more than 50 words in a year, right? Like, you know, I was dreaming about being a writer, or I was, you know, I was creating fantasies of what it must be like to be a writer, or something like that. But, you know, so we do have to be serious about it if we're going to do it. And I think you mentioned it too, and some others that I've interviewed, you know, you have to treat it like a job, right? Like it's, you know, when I've worked at different places, right? And I'm sure everybody's had this experience, you know, if you're supposed to be at work at 9 a.m. on Monday morning, you don't show up at 9:45, right? You know, you show up at 9 a.m. If you're going to be a writer, you have to figure out when to put in that time, right? And nobody's telling you to, right? Because nobody's going to say, hey man, you should be a writer, here, show up at this time and right. I'll give you money, right? So this is when this is when you have to make that decision to show up and do the work, even when, you know, nobody's reading it and nobody's paying you for it. And you just have to kind of figure, you know, I think like you said, do you enjoy it enough? Are you good at it? You know, and then are you going to stick with it? But if not, hey, do something else, right? Like,
there's no shame in deciding you want to do something else. Absolutely. Or if you decide, you know, this is just a hobby, you know, fine, you know, do it just to have fun, please yourself. Great. You know, I think we're talking more of, you know, people who want to do it on some level of professionally, and and it's, all those levels are fine. Yeah. It's just deciding, just being intentional about what you want, and knowing that, you know, if you want the harder path, that you're willing to put in the work. But then also, you know, when you put in the work and then you start experiencing milestones that you had been hoping to experience, that's when, I mean, the work itself has to be rewarding. So you've got to love the work itself, which I do. I you know, love the whole creation process. But then also, if you do it long enough and, you know, put the work in and you start hitting those milestones of things that you had thought about, or what would it be like, to get there, to see your book on a bookstore shelf, to do a signing, to get fan mail, to, this and that. And that's the extra stuff that starts getting peppered in. That's like, and for me, at least, I mean, that's as cool as I had hoped it would be. Walking into a store, seeing your books there, and being able to, sign the stock that the bookstore has, and just being part of the author community, doing events with other authors and things, and getting to kind of pass on knowledge to people who are where I was, 10 years ago. That's all super fun and very rewarding.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that is a great point about milestones, because it doesn't happen overnight, right? And if we can find little wins along the way, right?
Absolutely.
I think, that is going to propel us forward and say, oh, maybe I'm doing something here, right? And some little, every once in a while, that little bit of feedback, or that little bit of kind of reinforcement that just says, okay, maybe I should do one more. And that's exactly what happened to me when I started doing my role-playing game books. It's just like I put out something and it was like, oh my gosh, this thing I made in like an hour that I was just offering for free because I didn't think anybody would pay for me, got like 4,000 downloads in 2 days. And you're just like, people want that. Okay. What can I do with this? Okay. I put out something else. Oh, they're paying me money for this. Oh, well, that's fantastic. And, little milestones like that can, build, and keep, propelling us forward and forward. And I think that's always a good thing if people want that, right? I mean, you can write your Star Trek fanfic and, and post it and be happy at doing whatever you want in your life. And nobody's going to think, I think that's awesome. And, everybody's going to think it's cool. Nobody's going to think less of you, but it's just like, if it's something that's been eating with you, and I usually try to tell people, when I go to a convention or something, it's just like, if you've been thinking about, writing a role-playing game or writing a book since you were like, pre-10, and you just haven't done it yet, then you probably should try to at least do it. Spend some time, trying to figure out some of the process. And then if you say, actually, I don't want to do it, then fine. But like, if you've been thinking about it for like 25 years, you should probably at least, give it some kind of shot. But if you so you really know that it's a dream, or it's a hobby, or it's something that you really want to do.
Yeah. I mean, if you scratch the itch and the itch is gone, you accomplished what you wanted to. If you scratch the itch and you get 10 more itches, then that may be a good indication that maybe you should, try again. Either one's fine.
Yeah, absolutely. And somebody may write one short story and say, oh, well, I had that story in me and I'm done. And I don't want to do that. There are other people. I know me, I had like 15 ideas when I took a shower this morning, and I was in there for all of like 4 minutes. And so I can't stop. So either I either need to do something with it, or it's going to drive me crazy. And, Ryan, I am so sorry. I am talking like your ear off. I totally lost track of time. It is way past our time on the interview. Why don't you, I have like 5 other questions I just thought of to ask you, but why don't I just ask you, where can people find your books? How can they support your work? And maybe what does the future hold for you as an author?
Yeah, happy to tell you. And I will say to you, and if you want to cut this out, feel free. If you have more questions, I'm happy to talk about them. But if you want to keep to your show time, that's totally cool too. Okay. Whatever you want for your show. But yeah, so they can find my work. It's very accessible. The Time Shift trilogies, because that's a little bit older. You're probably not going to see those just sitting on bookshelves, but you can get those still at Amazon and online retailers, whatever you like there. This Last Adventure, that's a new release. And that's available pretty much everywhere. That'll be in bookstores, on all the online retailers. If you have a favorite bookstore that you like to shop at, if it's not on their shelf, you can request it and they'll order it. If you're a library person, which we love libraries as well, then any library, even if it's not on the shelf, you can usually request a book. And at that point, they'll acquire it for you. Libraries are, good for authors too. They buy lots of books. So, it's Ryan Dalton on Twitter, Ryan Dalton on Instagram, RyanDaltonWrites.com is my website. I'm very out there and accessible. So, feel free to run and get a book, or if anyone wants to reach out to me, feel free to do that too.
Awesome. And I will be sure to put all of those links in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So anybody who is listening right now can head over there and you can check out Ryan's social media. You can check out his website. You can check out his books, and you could drop him a line if you really wanted to. So Ryan, it was a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me. I had a great time.
All right, there you have it, guys. I really hope you enjoyed my conversation with Ryan today. I know we kind of dove into some nuts and bolts on writing and publishing. I hope you found it interesting. As I mentioned in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com, you will find links to Ryan's books, so you can check those out. I encourage you to do so. All right, if you want some free stuff, head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You'll get 20 free dungeon maps. You'll get a custom D&D 5e character background. You will get some other little tidbits that you will have to find out what those are by heading over there. You will also never miss an episode of this show, and each and every Friday, you'll get an email update letting you know what is going on in the wild, wild world I like to call Dice Geeks. All right, guys, I thank you so much for listening today. As always, if you would like to support the show in some way, you can like, rate, review, or subscribe to it. Those things help the show immensely, and I would greatly appreciate it if you did those. If you want to help out the show financially, you can do so at patreon.com/dicegeeks. All right, now, guys, until next Wednesday, keep gaming!